Have you ever heard of a place that is so quiet that you wonder if time has stopped? A place where the fog is too thick and the birds are afraid to sing. I'll take you there. Grendale is the name of the village that is tucked away in the Yorkshire Dales. Maps made today won't show it. Most English people have never heard of it, and those who have don't talk about it anymore. But in October 1884, a woman named Eleanor Blythe went there by herself, having been sent away. Here it is now. This is where things get weird, so please hold on. She was trained as a nurse at London's Bethlehem Royal Hospital and was smart and skilled, but she wasn't praised. Instead, she was punished. Why? Since she was honest. Eleanor had found out about a powerful bishop who couldn't be stopped and who was abusing his religious power to hurt people. Not physically, but mentally and spiritually. You know the type. As a prize, they sent her to Grendale. It looked like a peaceful spot to think on paper. A church that was turned into a safe place for people with mental illnesses. Eleanor didn't find that, though. And no one was ready for what you're about to hear. She was left alone. No train stop, no greeters, just a carriage that pulled up out of the fog, because of a guy who wouldn't look at her. As soon as she got up, he left. There were no words, only the sound of the gate closing behind her. That was the first sign. Before her was the abbey, which was cold, gray, and very tall. The land looked younger than it was, itself. It wasn't rebuilt or fixed up. It was just kept, as if something were keeping it living. Sister Magdalene met her at the door. Imagine a person made of stone and the Bible. There was a long, heavy pause before she finally said, "You'll find the walls here hold a memory." They remember the bad behavior. Eleanor's boron was shown to her room, which was more like a cell with a cot and a cross. A single Latin word was carved on top of the doorframe. Words that connect. Words are chains. Take that in. At Grendale, the patients were not allowed to talk. Not a word or a question. They were told that the total silence would help them get better and calm their minds. But that quiet is the thing. It wasn't calm. It looked ready. Eleanor had trouble sleeping that first night. You know how it feels when a room is too quiet? Like the walls are just listening. That's how she felt. Then she heard something that wasn't footsteps or prayers. It was a soft, far-away humming sound. She pushed, her ear to the ground. It wasn't coming from the church. It wasn't the wind. It came from below. You've never been to Grendale if you thought quiet was peaceful. There, silence wasn't just the lack of sound. It was rule, doctrine, and punishment, and it was strange that everyone followed it. Take a moment, though, before we go any further. If something about this place makes you feel uncomfortable and interested, please don't forget to like this movie. Give it 2. Someone who likes scary historical stories. Subscribe to get more stories like this, and let me know what you think in the comments. Would you make it through a place where you can't talk? Let's go back to Grendale. Eleanor walked around the rooms of the monastery that had been turned into a sanitarium for the first full day. Long stone floors that had been worn down by generations of barefoot steps lined the hallways. It was quiet. There were no bells, clocks, or music, only the sound of wood scraping against glass, clothes rustling, and the wind blowing against the glass. The patients were very, very quiet. They moved almost exactly at the same time, like sleepwalkers who got stuck in a loop. They didn't cry, cough, or whisper, not even to each other. Eleanor smiled at a woman who looked to be no more than 20 years old. The girl's eyes were moving. Even though her lips were shaking like they wanted to talk, she didn't. She was unable to. Later that same day, Eleanor was asked to come to the church for what you could call an orientation. There, she met Father Quill, the priest who was in charge of the place. He wore clothes from before thee. They were in a building and spoke in a voice that was always quiet. He said that speech is where cheating starts. It grows on the tongue like mold grows on wet stone. Here, we get rid of the sinful mouth by being quiet. Eleanor asked patients how they talked about emergencies, pain, worry, and illness, to which he simply answered, "Their souls will be heard. If they are still loud, they are not yet ready." That night, she wrote it down in her journal. That and the word divine muteness, which was a way of therapy she had never seen before. Writings about medicine. It was said to clean the soul by getting rid of vocal temptation. But what she saw didn't look like it was getting better. It looked like an eraser. Each person in the study wore a string of thin metal rings around their necks. A nurse told Eleanor they're called soul catches for any word that tries to escape. That night, Eleanor couldn't get rid of the feeling that she was being watched, not by the staff or the church, but by the silence itself. It was crowded, heavy, and almost living here. And behind it all, that sound again. A low, regular humming that sounds like a choir without mouths. She went after it to the old pharmacist in the western well wing. They said it was locked and not being used, but she swore she heard moving and then something worse through the door. Something. One word said like a breath in the winter can help. She turned the handle, but it wouldn't move. Once more, the quiet had grown thick. Grendale was for a reason, built on top of a hill, not for fame or light, but to keep things in. After 2 days on the job, Eleanor started to see a trend. 1 hour after bedtime every night, a soft, almost melodic sound would come from under her room. There was no music or wind. Instead, there was something strange, almost human. It started out as a soft hum. Then another voice joined, and then another, and maybe even more. There are no words or songs. There's only clean, eerie, and empty harmony. A younger sister was asked about it by Eleanor. The woman stopped moving. Mid-step, she looked up at the roof of the chapel quickly before whispering a single word. "Do not talk about the band." Eleanor sneaked out of her room that night with just her notebook and a lantern. It was colder than normal in the halls, and the chapel was empty with a black cloth over the altar. But behind the refuge there were a few narrow steps. It wasn't clear to her until she found a door with no handle and only a keyhole. Above it was a worn, red chalk drawing. The lower choir is called Canis Inferius. It didn't have any keys or locks. The door was made to stay shut. The buzzing kept coming through. She came back every night to try to time the pattern. Every time someone hummed, it started with a low C note and then got more complicated, like a band practicing a song they could never finish. Something changed on the 5th night, though. The hum stopped. After that, there was a moment of complete quiet that was louder than any sound. After that, there was a faint scream. After that, nothing. The hallway had a mild smell of wax and burned paper by dawn. Eleanor. Sister Magdalene was told about it. The nun smiled for the first and only time in her life and told Eleanor, "You're starting to hear the shape of things." Later that day, Eleanor walked by the oldest part of the monastery, the south wing, which was closed to both staff and patients. There was one door at the end that led to a jar. There was a stone jabar inside with thin wooden chairs that were bolted to the floor. There was dust on everything but one thing, a cot. One small, hand-carved crib that is empty. Next to it was a rusty plaque. We were made in quiet. We came back in quiet. Before she left quickly, she looked at the seats and saw the symbol. Spirals, crosses inside crosses, and Amelia's name written 12 times. Hi, Amelia. Hi, Amelia. That night, the sound came back, but this time it was different. A second beat that sounds like footsteps moving quickly just below the stone. Under the choir, someone or something was moving. Eleanor didn't go to sleep. She now knew that the rule of silence wasn't just a rule. It was for safety, and there was a stir in the dark under their prayers. Some customs are so old that the church acts like they never happened. In Grendale, one of them was called the split. Eleanor found the first sign of it in the hospital, hidden behind a falling brick near the fireplace. It was a small bag sealed with wax and wrapped in red cloth. She found 5 things inside: a rusty bell clapper, a piece of white thread, a page of Latin text, a lock of hair from a child, and the name Marjorie Ainsworth written on the back of the parchment in shaking ink, worn-out red writing. There were 3 Latin words scrolled across the edges in a vertical line: body, mind, speech, or body, mind, and speech. She went back to her room, copied the writing, and put it in her journal. That night, she looked through the records of the monastery. They were kept in a dusty room 2 floors above the long-forgotten chapel, which had bent books and stained glass windows that had been broken over time. Most of the books were records, lectures, and old, faded registries, but she found it hidden inside a hollowed-out hymnal, a volume. It is bound in velvet and hasn't been catalogued yet. The text is written in gold leaf, but it's hard to see now. Reyes cut Volman off during the rite of cutting. She slowly turned the pages. There were pictures of the tongue, vocal cords, and brainstem that showed how they are put together. But these weren't pictures of medical things. They were directions for a ritual. There are prayers, wax symbols, and music staves on each page. They were called things like the sacrament of dissociation, the mute blessing, and the severance, which was the most important one. It was described as a rite that was once only given to clergy who fell into error, a final act of cleansing that took away the weight of speech, self, and sin. Not figuratively, but really. What was left after speech was taken out, memories were sealed, and selfhood was erased was called anointed. In 1704, the rite was called heretical because several monks died while doing it, either by accident or because they refused to do it. It was officially banned, and its records were burned. But here it was, kept secret. And if Eleanor's feelings were right, yes, it was still practiced. The following day, Eleanor saw that 3 patients were not at their regular benches during mealtime. There was no reason or mention. That phrase stuck with Eleanor for days until she remembered the humming, the locked door, and the empty cradle. Sister Magdalene's cold answer: "They've transcended vocal temptation. They are now choirs in themselves." She went back to the chapel and pressed her against the secret staircase behind the altar. As I put my cold, locked hand on the door again, I heard a whisper, but this time it wasn't words, it was breath. It felt like the door let out a breath. Taking a step back, her heart started beating fast. Then she saw it. She touched a small spot of warm blood just below the lock and was sure she heard a woman screaming in Latin. One word, vox, vox voice over and over. Someone holds the keys to every organization, but they are not made of iron. They are made of fear. That person wasn't the priest or sister at Grendale. Mary Magdalene. The bell mistress was the name of the person that no one dared to talk about openly. A client told Eleanor about the name for the first time. She was about 16 years old, as thin as reed, and had scars on her neck from where the soul catcher used to be too tight. The girl hadn't talked in weeks, but when Eleanor took off the collar to clean it, the girl leaned in and whispered, "Don't let her ring the bell. Not for you." Eleanor stopped and asked, "Who?" The girl's eyes darted to the rafters. She watches from above and waits for things to break. That night, Eleanor looked through the monastery records again. There was no official mention of a bell mistress, but on the last page of an old ledger from 1991, she found an entry that said the bell tower was condemned and that it was not to be used. Sister Evelyn stayed inside to think. The bells only rang for rites of the tongue. Nothing else was written. No date of death or replacement was given, just the name, Sister Evelyn. In the morning, Eleanor went back to the chapel. There was a faded fresco of St. Cecilia above the altar, and a narrow, roped-off staircase wound up into the tower. The stairs were dusty, but the dust had just been stirred up. Eleanor waited until dusk to go back. Everyone else had gone home, and the halls were dark. She climbed the stairs step by step, feeling the air get colder and thinner. At the top, there was a trap door, which she pushed open to enter a small, round, cracked, and cold stone room. The big bell in the middle scared Eleanor more than the bell itself. The figure kneeling next to it was a woman with ash-colored hair that didn't move. She had her back to Eleanor. The woman spoke before Eleanor. Eleanor could. Her voice wasn't that of an old woman. It was young, clear, and horrible. "I heard your questions. I heard them before you asked them." The woman slowly stood up. Her face was wrinkled, but not old, and her eyes were cloudy, like she was half blind and half sure of everything. The woman stepped closer and said, "You think silence is cruel. You think it takes something from them, but no nurse. It frees them. It separates them from their madness, their sin, and themselves." She pointed to the bell and said, "I ring only for those who resist, for those whose voices still try to crawl back out." She then leaned in and said, "I only have to ring once." A single chime echoed in the air, not from the bell. It was hard for her to breathe as she ran down the stairs, through the chapel, and back to her room. When she opened the door, there was a fresh, wet soul catcher on her pillow and carved above her bed. It said, "You've been heard." There are rooms in old buildings that were never meant to be found, not because they were well hidden, but because the people who built them hoped you'd never ask the right questions. Eleanor found the House of the Mouthless by accident. It started with a draft of cold, earthy current beneath the apothecary wing. She followed it, tracing the stone until her hand caught on a notch in the wall. It gave way, and a panel slid back with the sound of breath escaping a coffin. Behind it was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the belly of Grendale. The air got thick with lime and mildew, and when she got to the bottom, she was in a room that shouldn't have had windows or candles. The room was round, like a baptismal chamber, but instead of water there were rows of still people sitting still. They all wore the same gray robe and had a soul catcher on their throat, but these were older and welded shut. Their mouths had been sealed, not sewn shut, with flesh growing over and lips gone. Eleanor wanted to leave, but something made her stay. She carefully walked through the room and looked into their eyes. They weren't dead or unconscious. They were listening. A woman, holding a locket, touched Eleanor's hand and put a folded note in it that was barely readable. It said, "They left our minds intact. We remember every word, every scream, every song, but we can never sing again." Below it, she rang the bell to keep us quiet, but the song lived on below. "Please don't let it end with us." Eliana looked up and saw that the woman's eyes were filled with silent tears. Suddenly, the humming got louder, not in pitch, but in presence. The sound was not in the room, but in her chest and skull. It felt like it was pulling at something very old. Suddenly, a door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see Sister Magdalene standing in the archway. She wasn't angry or shocked, but disappointed. "You shouldn't have come here, Eleanor." Eleanor tried to speak, but Magdalene raised her hand. "They are our sacred burden. We tend their silence. We preserve their purity." She pointed to the rows of seated figures. "They were once like you, curious, caring, and far too." Magdalene stepped aside and said, "Anointed." She let the word hang in the air, as if it explained everything. And maybe it did in Grendale. Where speech is forbidden, truth takes on stranger forms. Eleanor stopped writing in her journal after her trip to the House of the Mouthless. It wasn't because she lost her voice, but because she was afraid someone might be reading it. Instead, she started to watch in silence like they did. She noticed the candles. There were ones in every hallway, dorm, chapel, kitchen, and every room in Grendale. But something was wrong. They didn't melt like normal wax. They burned too slowly. Some stayed lit for weeks, and the smell changed slightly from room to room. Vanilla in the ward, frankincense in the chapel, and cedar in the western wing. Then one night she found one that smelled like iron and blood. It was near the altar, hidden behind a fallen tapestry. There was a dull red candle in a rusted bronze holder. The flame danced and flickered in a strange way, as if it were fighting the air around it. She took it back to her room and melted it into a shallow bowl. As the wax pulled, she saw it. Latin script letters etched in circles that were barely visible inside the base of the candle. She tilted the bowl toward the light and carefully traced them. Vox occudit, lux confetti, which means the voice dies, the light confesses. She went back to the chapel the next night. Slowly, she started to gather old candle bases, scraping off soot and melting wax from dozens of them. Under each one, she found pieces of writing, names, verses, commands, and single words. When she put them next to each other, they told a story, a broken-up, fearful prayer. "She rings a silent but light cannot lie when the bell tolls 3 times, the memory said. Burn the final candle. Let the hymn be reborn." That last line scared Eleanor. There was a final candle. She didn't know where or what would happen if it went out, but someone had left these notes a long time ago. The mute patients started to watch her more closely, as if they were hoping she would understand. She didn't tell anyone about what she found. One night she went back to the chapel and saw a small white taper sitting tauntingly at the altar. It wasn't lit, and the wick was soaked in something darker than wax. There was a note next to it for the 3rd toll, scratched faintly into the pew below it, barely visible under the varnish. Amelia lit her own candle, and she burned the silence. The candle was hidden by Eleanor. She didn't know who Amelia was yet, but she was sure she would. There was a name before the silence. Eleanor had seen it 3 times, carved into a pew, burned into wax, and whispered through absence. The name was a Meliano last name or title, just the name repeated like a prayer or a warning. Eleanor went back to the House of the Mouthless with a folded page from the Book of Excision that she had hidden in her habit. She walked slowly between the figures. She stopped in front of the woman who gave her the note and the locket. Eleanor knelt down and gently opened the locket. Inside, there wasn't a portrait but a name scratched with something sharp. Amelia. Behind the name, which was faded from breath and oil, was a piece of parchment with one word written on it. That night, Eleanor went back to the dormitory wing, which was the oldest part of Grendale. The floorboards creaked not from pressure, but from memories. She began tapping lightly along the planks to test their weight. There was a hollow echo under the farthest bed in the corner, which she opened with a lantern hook. Under it was a journal wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. The cover was so worn that it couldn't be read, but the ink inside was clear enough that it wasn't scripture or notes. It was a record, a personal one. It started, "My name is Amelia Whitlock. I was brought here to hear voices. They called it divine madness. I called it music." Eleanor turned the page. "They made me swallow silence, but I kept the song hidden not in my throat, but in my hands I carved it into wax and hid it in light because I knew they would erase me. They think the bell ends the voice, but the voice goes inward, roots itself, and waits. When the third bell rings, it blooms. If you found this light, the last candle, but not in the chapel or the tower where they cut me off, that's where the song returns, under the nursery, under the cradle. There was a plaque under the journal that said, "In silence we were made. In silence we return." But maybe that wasn't scripture. Maybe it was Amelia's curse. The next morning, Eleanor found that her bed had been moved 6 inches away from the wall. Her journal was still there, but her pillow had a small new item on it. A red, curved piece of stained glass with the words 3 tolls carved into it in a way that was hard to see. She didn't know who had left it, but she did. Eleanor waited until the 3rd night after finding Amelia's journal. She timed it so that Sister Magdalene took her sleeping draught at midnight, and the bell tower was quiet. She crept past the infirmary and the west wing and back to the old nursery. It was darker and colder than before, and the cradle was still in the middle of the room under a soot-covered stained glass window. Ashes of dust clung to the air. Eleanor knelt next to the cradle and ran her fingers along the floorboards below it. One of them clicked, and she pried it open. Underneath, there wasn't a compartment, but a hole. There was a narrow shaft going straight down with stone rungs built into the wall. It was a secret passageway. She climbed down, holding Amelia's candle tightly in one hand. The descent took longer than she thought, 15 steps, then 20, and finally she stepped into a place no one had been before. The room was round and made out of stone. There was no light, an altar, or any writings. Instead, there were hundreds of marks on the walls, including musical notations, Latin phrases, and rough drawings of mouths that were closed. In the middle was a pedestal with a bowl of cold, blackened wax. The floor around the bowl had soot trails, which meant that something had burned violently here in the past. She stepped forward, her heart racing, and put Amelia's candle in the bowl, but she didn't light it yet. What was she going to do? She looked around the chamber again and realized something scary. There were no doors or stairs leading in, but there were chains along the far wall, still bolted and stained. Then she heard a whisper, not a voice, but a wind circling the chamber and pressing against her back. She turned around, and the walls started to hum low, resigned, human. It was the sound of dozens or hundreds of voices without mouths, the hum of the anointed. Eleanor grabbed the match, and her hand shook. If she lit the candle here, as she struck the match and held it above the wick, she heard the first bell toll, then silence. When the bell toll rang, Eleanor stopped. The match in her hand flickered. Amelia's candle wick leaned forward, waiting. Time stopped in the room below the cradle. But silence didn't come back. Instead, the hum, living resonance changed. It stopped sticking to the walls and breathed. It knew what was going on. Eleanor dropped the match, and the wick caught. The flame hissed, and at that moment the candle didn't just burn, it glowed. It was brighter than any other candle she'd seen in Grendale. The wax bled black, then crimson, then gold, as if it remembered colors it had buried. The hum got louder, adding something new to it. A melody that was broken up and childlike, but underneath it, a harmony Eleanor didn't know she knew. It was an old hymn that was painfully unfinished. The candlelight grew in a way that didn't make sense, lighting the room. The first bell rang, but it wasn't from the tower. It was from below, from the stone itself. Eleanor stumbled backwards. The pedestal broke. The walls shook with the force of memory. Above her, in the nursery, she heard hurried, unsteady footsteps. She climbed back up the shaft, her heart racing. When she came out, the nursery was filled with smoke. All the candles had lit themselves, all of them burning gold. And in the middle of the room, sister." "You lit it," Magdalene whispered. Eleanor nodded. "I had to." Magdalene stepped forward. Her voice broke. "Do you know what you've done behind her?" The cradle rocked once, but there was no wind. Then Eleanor heard a child's voice singing Amelia's song from inside the cradle. Magdalene fell to her knees. "We buried her under stone and sacrament. We said she had died." She looked up with tears running down her cheeks, but she wasn't sick. She was too pure for this place. Amelia's candle flame started to flicker low, but the singing didn't stop. It came from the hallways, the vents, and even the wood of Grendale. All around them, the anointed were humming together for the first time, and they weren't in pain. There are 3 tolls in every ritual, one for silence, one for obedience, and the third is for. As soon as Amelia's song filled the nursery, the building responded by lighting up the hallways with candles. The old, stained glass, which had been blackened by soot for a long time, started to shimmer with color, as if memory had melted away the grime of denial. And from the deepest hallways, the humming of the mouthless turned into voice. It wasn't speech. It was music, a sound that wasn't made by lungs or tongue, but by memory itself. Sister Magdalene stood on her knees shaking and whispered, "It's not supposed to happen like this." The third toll meant judgment, but Eleanor stepped forward with her eyes fixed. No, they were lying. Suddenly, every bell in Grendale's tower, which had been rusting and dormant for a long time, rang, not struck. It was torn open by something deeper. Toll, a sound so heavy it cracked the old rafters and so deep it shook dust from the ceiling like falling ash. The third toll, and in its wake, voices, hundreds of them, male and female, young and old, each unique and once silent, had found their song. Eleanor ran down the hallway toward the chapel. The hallway was filled with people. The walls seemed to breathe both stone and testimony. The pews inside the chapel were no longer empty. The anointed stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed and lips sealed, but singing from the inside. Their voices harmonized, not with words, but with peace. You could feel it in your ribs, in your teeth, and in the middle aisle, standing under the old black crucifix. Amelia, or maybe just what was left of her, was clear, young, and dressed in the white robe of a nun. She looked at Elin with eyes that were sad and older than sadness. "They couldn't erase me," she said, because someone would always ask why. Eleanor moved closer. "What do I do now?" Amelia's shape flickered as if she were caught between time and memory. She let the hymn end, then turned and walked toward the altar. As she did, the candles in the chapel began to flare one by one, and the walls started to tremble, but not because they were falling down, but because they were letting go. You see, Grendale had never been a place of healing. The vault wasn't meant to heal, but to hide the music that wouldn't go away. But now it could no longer hold. Institutions don't fall like buildings, they unravel like lies. The song inside Grendale had grown too big for its walls, and too loud for its silence. As Amelia got to the altar, the crucifix above her broke down the middle in a jagged, splintering line that split the image of salvation in two. The candle's flames turned blue, then out. Faces of patients who had been forgotten, nurses who had disappeared, and children whose names had never been written down in the ledgers appeared out of the smoke. They stood in the pews, not as ghosts, but as memories that would not die. Sister Magdalene fell to her knees again, her eyes wild, whispering prayers Eleanor had never heard. "They said we were preserving the sacred," she muttered. "We were preserving a prison." Eleanor walked toward the altar. The paper of Amelia. Still in her coat pocket was the candlestick, which she held in her hand but had now turned into wick and memory. She looked at the memories, but none of them spoke. Instead, they looked at her as if to ask, "Will you carry us?" When there was a tremor in the chapel, the stained glass windows broke outward, not inward, sending light into the sky like confession finally leaving the body. The bell tower then groaned, not to chime, but to warn. Grendale was falling apart, not burning, shedding. Every stone, nail, and hymn was engraved in. Elena ran through the halls, past rooms that now bled light, past relics that had been taken down from the walls, and past voices humming the last note of a song that was never meant to end. When she got to the outer gate, she turned around once and saw Amelia, or what was left of her, still standing in the doorway of the chapel, surrounded by people who had been hidden. Amelia smiled and said, "You don't have to remember it all. Just remember what happened." "Remember that it was," she said, bowed her head, and disappeared in the light. Grendale is no longer shown on any maps. Records show that it was closed in 1904 because it was unsafe. The foundations cracked, the chapel sank, and the stones were taken back by the trees. But Eleanor knew it wasn't collapse. It was freedom. She walked for hours, maybe days, down an old path. The trees tried to forget that she was wearing soot and candle wax on her coat, and her hands were empty except for Amelia's journal. The last pages were. No one got on the train. No one asked her where she was from, and no one dared. She got to the village at dawn, the one where patients used to be taken. The train still went through, but no one got on. At the inn, she was given a room without being asked. The landlady said, "Only, I haven't seen anyone come down that road since I was a girl." Eleanor nodded. No one ever does. Not really. That night, she lit the last stub of the candle. It flickered briefly. That strange smell of cedar, iron, and ash lingered, along with a thought. What if truth doesn't live on in books or testimonies? What if it lives on in scents, wax, and the breath between notes of a song that no one was allowed to finish? She opened her notebook and started to write, not as a nurse or a witness, but as the first voice after silence. What she wrote wasn't a report. It was a hymn. It had been 42 years since Eleanor had last walked that road, and the candle had gone out. She had changed her name, moved twice, and worked as a librarian in a coastal town where no one asked her why she never sang. She never got married, but she kept Amelia's journal locked in a drawer. One morning in late fall, a letter arrived, typed nicely. It was from Harold Evington, an archaeologist with the Royal Historical Institute, and it was about former religious care homes in Northern Ireland. England, especially those who were sentenced between 1890 and 1920. The Grendale order comes up in several oral histories, but doesn't have any written records. I found a partial registry that makes me think you may have worked there. Would you be willing to talk to me? Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She boiled tea and then didn't touch it. After that, she opened the drawer. The notebook inside is now brittle, and there is a piece of stained gush red paper under it. Bed 3. Tolls. The candle next to her bed caught fire once that night. The room smelled the same, iron ash and wood. Eleanor dreamed that the church wasn't broken down, but was whole and full of music and light that didn't hurt. She agreed to meet the Archbishop the next morning. They sat across from each other with their teacups still empty. He came with papers, maps, plans, and copies of church ledgers that had been changed. He said, "I think the site is buried under a military forestry zone." After a fire in 1904, they locked it up. There were no survivors. Written down, but I found this. He moved a picture across the table. Eleanor just looked. The nursery wasn't on fire, and gold lights lit the room. Where did you get this? Harold was unsure. A secret set of things. The picture was taken in 1889, but there's no proof that it was ever taken. Eleanor looked again, and there was a girl in the back of the picture, visible through the stained glass. She wasn't quite facing the camera, but she was singing with her mouth open and her eyes closed. Harold said she's in a few pictures but has never been named. Only Eleanor agreed. Slowly. Her name wasn't Amelia. Eleanor spoke. She got up, went to the drawer, got the book back, and carefully put it on the table. Eleanor put her hand on Harold's and told him not to touch it. "She told you to read it, but know this." She leaned in and lowered her voice. "You're not studying a wreck when you write or say her name. You are responding to a song. The archivist never put his results in print. It's not official." The group ended its study into Grendale in the year, saying they couldn't find any reliable sources. Records were lost when the structure collapsed. But Harold Evington kept the diary Amelia wrote. He hand-copied every page. He even went to the locations that Eleanor had written in the margins. He found ash and oak trees, soil that was too soft to build on, no stones, and no church. But he was sure he heard something when the wind was just right and the day was quiet. No sounds of people or movements, just a melody. He wrote to Eliana one more time. No ask this time, just a line. 6 minutes were spent there. I didn't feel by myself. She never answered. A year after that, Eleanor died. They said that when they looked through her things, they didn't find any family. Instead, they found a locked drawer inside a burned candle stub and one line written on the last page of her journal. Today, the village that used to be next to Grendale has grown. It has a grocery store, a gas station, and a small community school. Kids walk along the roads that used to lead to the asylum and hum songs their parents taught them. People draw pictures that they say come from their dreams and ask why the wind sometimes sounds like a choir under the ground. But no one answers. But the trees and the stones know, and sometimes, when the chapel that no longer stands casts a shadow that it shouldn't, you might hear the third toll, which isn't of death but of memory.